Yo, start in the United States of America with the historical long-term unemployment going back to 1967. And as you can see, it's a Loch Ness monster of a thing with a definite trend upwards with a ridiculous sort of long neck and silly little head, which is obviously the long neck is the Great Recession. What we have here is a percentage of total unemployed who are out of work for 52 weeks or more for a whole year. Pretty rare in the United States, because if somebody wanted a job, generally they could just hop back into a job. So percentage of total unemployed who are out of work for 52 weeks or more. And even in 1983 was the first time it broke through 10% of the total unemployed being unemployed for a year. And probably quite a lot of voluntary in that. But still, now it's just shockingly out of whack, with over 30% of the unemployed have been now out of work for over a year. And harping on again, sorry about that, but it seems to be for the world is waiting on the United States. Whatever happens there is going to really make a major swing to what's happening. We know the rest of the world is moving towards a recession. If the United States can hold up, it'll just be a mild recession. But if the United States goes as well, it's going to be exceptionally painful. So this is the real consumption and confidence. Okay, University of Michigan consumer sentiment in red. Consumer sentiment. It's hard to know whether it leads or lags the spending. I think we can presume it leads marginally. But certainly we can say that they're coincident. But they're not at the moment. One of them is wrong. Either consumer sentiment is wrong or the spending percentage change is wrong. And if all things are equal like they normally are, they're going to join up again, meaning that consumer sentiment is going to fly sky high quite soon and join the blue, or the blue is going to drop right down to meet the red. And it's rather important which happens. This is the household savings rate, just another example of what is going on in the United States. With the saving rate, it's only a short-term chart, it's only going back a couple of years, but you can see they tried to do some saving, over 5.5%, but it's right down now to 3.5% again. And the great question is, why? And the great answer appears to be is because they're broke. Every single cent is being squeezed from them. And that's got a breaking point, which will tip over into recession. This is Reuters giving us Bank of America employees flood bank's rivals with resumes, their CVs. They know that the game is up at Bank of America, and they're trying to rats jumping the ship. Bank of America employees are flooding rival companies with resumes as major cost-cutting program gets underway at the second largest US bank. So they're going to be out of the frying pan and into the fire. They'd be better retraining as farmhands, although there's not much farming to be done in central New York. I don't know what they can do. I feel sorry for them. Bernanke and banks tested by latest market strains. Now, this is Wall Street Journal, and anything under this you've got to subscribe for, and I'm not paying the Wall Street Journal money. But it's odd, because it's the Fed, and it's John Hillenrath writing the article, and Hillenrath is the mainstream media via the Wall Street Journal's mouthpiece for the Fed. And the opening paragraphs seem weird to me. So if anybody's got any ideas, please comment and help me. 3 years after the global financial crisis, and a year after a US regulatory overhaul, is that the Dodd-Frank bill that nobody understands? The world economy remains vulnerable to hazards that nearly broke the banking system last time. So this is the Fed talking, effectively. Federal Reserve officials worry that investors could rush out of the $2.6 trillion money market mutual fund industry, where millions of Americans park their savings and where the world's banks come for short-term loans. It's talking Europe here. There are still no rules among nations for picking up the pieces after the collapse of a global financial giant. Banks have been on a roller coaster for months, and governments can no longer afford a rescue. I think that's some sort of cryptic language about something very deep and important, but I don't speak the lingo. Do you? Bloomberg, RIM, stocks fall below book value. Research in Motion seems to have stopped, limited. Stock fell below its book value for the first time in 9 years, a signal investors consider the BlackBerry maker to be worth less than the net value of its property, patents and other assets. Book value comprises a company's assets, including cash, inventories, real estate and intellectual property minus its liabilities. And RIM is worth less than all that put together. And quite a lot of banks, they vary over the weeks as they go up and down, but in their down moments in the United States, many of the banks are valued below book value, which tells you something as well. Although book value for banks is looked at in a slightly different way by different people. Shifting gears. Arabic is the mother tongue for 20% of Israel's citizens. Speaking to the US Congress in May, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu boasted that his country is a beacon of freedom in the Middle East and North Africa, that it is the only place where Arabs enjoy real democratic rights. It is true that Palestinian citizens of Israel have some democratic rights, like the vote, but as Netanyahu told Congress, the path of liberty is not paved by elections alone. And the summer months have seen an acceleration of worrisome anti-democratic trends. First, the Knesset passed the anti-boycott law, a move that was widely condemned as a strike against free speech and democracy. Even some of Israel's staunchest supporters expressed concern. Now lawmakers have introduced a bill that proposes to change the definition of Israel now into Jewish and democratic to, that was the old one, to the national home of the Jewish people, God's chosen people. If passed, the legislation would become part of Israel's basic laws, which are used as a working constitution. Whenever a conflict between democracy and Jewish values arises, the new definition of Israel would allow courts and legislators to favor the latter. According to Haaretz, the proposed bill will also make halacha, Jewish religious law, a source of inspiration to the legislature and the courts, and in the spirit of favouring the Jewish character of the state over the state of all its citizens, the legislation would also downgrade Arabic from an official language to one with special status. And have you noticed what they did because Palestinians got let into UNESCO? They said this is provocation, and this means that we're going to push ahead even faster with our building. I think they're the equivalent of RIM, by the way. Operate. OWS, the brand leaders cannot afford to ignore. Cannes, France. I can sense very clearly here at Cannes that this is the moment the masses start shaping the policy response to the global financial crisis. Why? Because everybody I speak to, interview or discuss background with keeps dropping the words Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street into their conversation. In fact, OWS, if OWS were a global brand, like the designer apparel shops that line the Rue d'Antibes here, I used to live on the Rue d'Antibes, it would have a profile to die for among the super elite. OWS has, in just a few weeks, become a global shorthand among policymakers for what can happen if they don't regain control of the situation. Once you get a coalition of perfectly ordinary people saying, "We've had enough," and then you have to watch as the cops baton and taser them in the name of trespass laws, you know you are in a reputational crisis. And this is Paul Mason, and he finishes the article with the subtext: "It's probably better to deal with protesters whose symbolic image is a ballet dancer pirouetting on top of the Wall Street Bull statue than some other less politically endearing iconography." I think probably the swastika being the less politically endearing iconography that is obliquely referred to there. Paul Mason, good man. Over in Greece, these are the new car registrations going back to just before 1990, where there used to be about 7,000 cars registered per month in Greece. But when they joined the euro, or when the euro was Eurofied in the turn of the century, in 00, there were up to 25,000 new cars registered in Greece every month. And that's the way it went until the great crisis hit, and they're just about back to where they started. But that's an awful lot, probably, of German cars that aren't being bought. Next, in a similar colours, is the EFS bond spread and France below it. And these are coincident as well. And the bond spread over bunds is just going up and up. It used to be 60, now it's 160 basis points. 1.5% you've got to offer on an EFSF bond, because they haven't got any money, this EFSF. It's just backing for selling bonds into the market. Those bonds are selling at an interest rate 1.5 above bunds. But you can see the way it tracks the French 10-year government bond, and everything, all that EFSF is riding on France. It is the pivot point. If it falls, as in its rate gets cut from AAA, the whole thing falls apart. Speaking of the EFSF bond, on Wednesday, they were planning to sell some of these bonds into the market to get some money together, so as to have it ready to pay an Irish bond coming due in November, 4.3 billion. But they cancelled it because they got the vibe from the market, and the vibe wasn't very good, so they pulled it and didn't sell it. It's not surprising. Right, let's finish with this. You'll recognise halfway through it that it's an old piece. But as Professor Martin Fieldstein pointed out in a major article in The Economist, 13th of June, this argument is very dangerously mistaken. If a country or region has no power to devalue, and it is not the beneficiary of a system of fiscal equalization, like the United States, then there is nothing to stop it suffering a process of cumulative and terminal decline, leading in the end to emigration as the only alternative to poverty or starvation. The Irish are curing quite a lot by emigrating. Now we get to see how dated this is. I sympathise with the position of those like Margaret Thatcher who, faced with the loss of sovereignty, wish to get off EMU train altogether, European Monetary Union. I also sympathise with those who seek integration under the jurisdiction of some kind of federal constitution, with a federal budget very much larger than that of the community budget. But what I find totally baffling is the position of those who are aiming for economic and monetary union without the creation of new political institutions, apart from a new central bank, and who raise their hands in horror at the word federal or federalism. This is the position currently adopted by the government and by most of those who take part in the public discussion and what happened in Europe, because that's the position of the European politicians. They were only pretending that they didn't want to go for federal and federalism and thought they could not scare people off so they didn't talk about federal and federalism, and they lured everybody in to this economic unit with this currency, but without the federal or federalism, which they knew would scare people off. But they thought, when trouble comes later, then we'll get our federal and federalism. Now the troubles come. And they didn't listen to people like Wynne Godley, who at the time of Margaret Thatcher, was telling them just what was and what was going to happen. Wynne Godley, incidentally, is looked upon as an iconic figure by the MMT people. Some people are right sometimes. Bye.